Sorry, I skipped slides there by accident. Um, this will make sense maybe a little later, but I'll introduce it now. Organic matter is, think of it as a nutrient reserve. Okay. At the very end of this lesson, I talk about fairly low nutrient content of compost. That doesn't mean it's not useful. It just has low nutrient content. And that's in terms of what's immediately available. But as it continues to give up nutrients from its organic matter, it's sort of like a slow release nutrient. So organic matter is that slow release ingredient. So it's important. Improve aggregate stability. So this is another kind of nebulous one. I'll highlight ones that are more important to me, but this means like the structure of your soil, right? Is it really crumbly? Will it hold its structure? Can you till it? You know, that kind of thing. Reduces bulk density, right? So we kind of talked about that already when we talked about compaction in another lesson. So it's more related to the idea that by having fluffy compost in there, the soil is less likely to compact, and so you end up with your soil being a little airy, a little fluffier, not so dense, which is good for providing air. Increases water holding capacity. So this is kind of in contradiction to this a little bit. You have to be careful. So compost tends to be, because of its organic content and the fact that it stabilizes soil, it does have a fairly high water holding capacity, which doesn't bode well for growing in compost directly. So keep that in mind. I'll mention that again later. Compost is a soil amendment. It is not a soil replacement. So you don't just take a bunch of compost, put it in a bucket, and start growing plants in it. Maybe it kind of would work, but it would not be as ideal as you if you were to blend it. In my video from visiting Thiessen Farms, they talk about taking their compost every year and spreading it with a manure spreader over their field and then rototilling it in, which works out to about not even 10% of their soil volume in the top 12 inches of soil. So it's a smaller percentage of the greater amount of soil that they're using. So they treat it like a fertilizer. Increases cation exchange capacity. Again, this will make more sense later in the course, but what this means is the ability of the soil to store and hold nutrients. So that's a really important property that, again, we'll look at more detail later in the course when we discuss soil sample testing and whatnot. Then there's enhances soil microbial community. Well, that's for sure, right? So there's lots of bugs and organisms. We already saw that in the last lab, that when you add compost, you're supplementing, just as if you're adding compost tea. Even just compost alone will boost the soil microbial population, which helps release and unlock nutrients that may be in your soil already. Suppressing soil pests. This is another really useful thing. The beneficial fungi and bacteria that come with compost will outcompete more pathogenic pests. So there's a bit of a protective quality. So that's a real bonus. And then, of course, last but not least is provide nutrients, right? I mean, that's kind of what it's all about. So provide nutrients. So we're going to look at the science behind composting. That's talking about air, oxygen, water, particle size, right? So what size particles do we need? The volume to create the right sort of chemical reaction. Carbon to nitrogen ratio, that's what your lab is all about. And then temperature and how temperature needs, my eraser's not working. And how temperature needs to be used to help clean the compost. So let's talk about that later. So let's start with aeration. This is actually a commercial compost facility. There's quite a few in Canada. It's a big business producing compost and putting it in bags and selling it at garden centers this time of the year. That stuff doesn't come from nowhere, right? So these are giant concrete bunkers. They're about 8 feet tall, and they run in this direction maybe about 200 feet, pretty far. And they put in their ingredients inside the bunker. They load it with a big front end loader. There's pipes all along the floor, and they use these squirrel cage fans to blow air in. and that percolates up through the soil mixture as it composts to encourage the correct bacteria to grow. So aeration is really important for microorganisms, especially the beneficial ones that will do all the decomposing. We want the right ones to grow so that we get the maximum pace for breaking down the organic molecules that are in the matter that you've put in here. What goes in here could be anything from organic matter from farms to maybe some straw, maybe a little bit of manure, and then that all breaks down and turns into your classic compost. We want to avoid anaerobic conditions because we get the wrong kind of bacteria growing. We get bacteria that use sulfur instead of oxygen, so disulfide, and that ends up consuming nitrogen, not providing it for our plants. It's not the best scenario for us. So we want to avoid that. We want to keep air in the compost. This is another picture showing you a field. You can see the pipes where the air is being blown in underneath. Here's your blower. And that air percolates up slowly through the soil and then exits. And that makes sure that all the bacteria in that pile are getting the oxygen they need to break down the material properly and avoid anaerobic conditions. Another picture, you can see the blowers, right? You can see the manifolds. So this is commercial scale composting. We need to achieve around 5% oxygen in the soil minimum to keep aerobic bacteria alive. Anything below that and we end up starting to get anaerobic conditions, and look at that, decomposition slows by up to 90%. So if you're running a business, you want your compost to form as quickly as possible. So you're going to put the electricity into that blower to keep the reaction going. So anaerobic bacteria do produce organic acids and amines that smell, and then that nitrogen is not available to plants. So it's really not what we want. They also produce a fair amount of ammonia, which is not particularly healthy for plants. So anaerobic conditions is not very good. We don't want that. If your compost smells bad, you are not doing yourself a favor. So your nose is a useful tool in that regard. So after oxygen, there's moisture. So everything on our planet needs water to live for the most part, some form of water. And decomposers are exactly the same. I mean, in our videos of looking at microorganisms, they're all swimming in some form of water film, whether it's the thin layer that's right around soil particles or even a flooded area, it's in water. So microorganisms can only use organic molecules that are dissolved in water. So that means that nutrients for the microorganisms are not available if there's not enough water to solubilize them. They can't just walk over to a dry crystal of some amine and mow down on it. It has to be dissolved in water for this to function. So when we're talking about compost, we're looking at around 40 to 60% water content. So in this sense, it's not uncommon for gardeners to actually get the garden hose and give their compost some water, like just actually run the water on it for a bit. Anything below 40% moisture content in our microorganisms will actually go dormant. They die, but they sporulate so that when moisture levels come back, they will grow again. But obviously at that time, you've lost their busyness, right? And if you add too much water, we get anaerobic conditions, so above 60%, and we make it wet and oxygen is displaced. So it's that happy medium again. But here's your clue to help you make sure you got the right amount of moisture. So you grab it and you give it a good squish with your hands. And if you're lucky, maybe 1 or 2 drops of moisture come out. That's about it. That's the right amount of moisture. Next thing was particle size. So you could just take your leaves and you could throw them in your compost as they are. But very large leaves tend to stick together like sheets of paper in a book, and you don't get very good oxygen and moisture penetration between those. So it takes a lot longer to break down. That's why leaves in a forest floor will take maybe 2 to 3 years to fully break down. Now in nature, trees like that because the leaves will help smother seedlings the next year to suppress their growth so that they're not competing for nutrients by their roots. But when we want composting to happen quickly, we need to shred whatever goes in our composter. And in that video on TEDx, you'll notice the guy talks about using a leaf vacuum that has an impeller that shreds the leaves into small particles so that the composting accelerates. So breaking down the particles, the organic matter, into smaller particles gives a larger surface area for bacteria and helps to accelerate that whole process. Not to a powder, but shredded, right? So we're talking like 1/2 centimeter square size. Then there's volume. As far as making your own compost, the magic number is a 3x3x3 or 4x4x4 structure. No smaller or no bigger. That gives you the ideal dimensions for composting to happen. Why? Well, it's sort of like math. You take the volume versus surface area. So with those dimensions, we have the right amount of volume in here, whether it's a square or a sphere, right? And that means that in the center, we can have a lot of the reaction happening. And on the outside areas, we have lots of oxygen getting access to the material. If it's too big, we need to force air in like those commercial composters. Well, for your average gardener, we're not looking at spending a lot of electricity to run our composting. That we just want it to happen. If you just want it to happen, this is the dimensions: with 3x3x3 to 4x4x4. No smaller, no bigger. That's your ideal. We call that critical mass to get the right temperature happening inside and the right amount of oxygen. So that's what's so critical about that. Some of the commercial ones you can buy are quite small, and they struggle to get the temperatures in the center that help really sterilize the compost. So keep that in mind. This is using just simply shipping pallets that are a very common method for making a composter. And they're just stacked and nailed together to form a box. So if you want to make a decent composter, that's definitely a really good way to go. You get good aeration coming from the sides. They've used chicken wire to keep animals out and keep the material from falling through the slats on the skid. But oftentimes you can get away with just putting the skids together, depending on the spacing on the slats. This is a commercial one. This is 2.5 feet by 4 feet. Not ideal, but it works. Composting, again, like the video in TEDx, composting happens, right? Like Mother Nature will find a way to make it work. But if you want it to work at its optimal pace and achieve the highest temperatures, then you need to get as close to that square or spherical volume as possible. This is another attempt at making something that's about the right dimensions, and it's cylindrical. They've just taken some fencing and made a loop and put a chicken wire lid on. That's great because we've got excellent oxygen coming in the side, so for aeration. A bit difficult to turn. At the very last slide, I'll show you a really useful tool for mixing compost, so stay tuned for that. So anyways, that's a really cool composter. Now let's talk about carbon to nitrogen ratios. This is really critical for compost to happen. Again, here's a video link. If you go through my slides where there's no audio, you can click on these links and they'll work. So we need to understand what we mean by carbon and what we mean by nitrogen. Oops, I struggle to get my eraser to work, sorry. Today at least. So greens are plant matter that's high in nitrogen, right? And browns are plant materials that are high in carbon. We're going to go through a list to give you an idea of what some of those look like. But greens could be things like grass clippings or fresh produce, trimmings from your kitchen. Those are fresh. So usually the rule of thumb is greens have been recently alive and browns have been dead for a long time. So browns, things like straw, newspapers, wood chips, constitute browns. So those are high in carbon, not a lot of nitrogen, because a lot of the easily degradable components have long disappeared, and it's just the resistant cellulose and lignin that's left. So they're high in carbon. The ratios we're looking for composting to happen, and this is from your lab, we need to try to achieve this ratio, 25 to 30 to 1, browns to green. So we're looking for way more browns than greens. And this is where a lot of times kitchen scrap wastes end up causing problems. This is another one of these sort of misunderstood things. People have a composting bucket and they throw all kinds of fresh green stuff in their kitchen in there. The problem is they're not paying attention to their brown to greens ratio. So they overwhelm the compost with lots of nitrogen with not enough carbon. And you end up with a really bad situation that causes a lot of anaerobic bacteria to grow, and you lose a lot of your nutrients to the atmosphere, and it creates toxic molecules in what's left. So this is not great scenarios for your garden. So overdoing the greens is definitely something you want to avoid. So we're going to look a little more at this. What do organisms use? What do microorganisms use these parts? So carbon, just think of it as sugar. It's an energy source, right? And nitrogen is for building proteins. When you look at your own diet, we use a lot more carbon than we do protein. And plants and microorganisms are really no different. They're looking for the energy for their day-to-day activities. And when they want to build some new proteins, they're definitely going to need some, but not as much as they do need the sugars. So all the internet diets aside and stuff like that, let's not get into that. But at the end of the day, we need a lot more carbon than we do nitrogen. So 25 to 30 to 1, with carbon being the higher content. So especially aerobic bacteria, they oxidize organic matter and release carbon dioxide. And the oxidation of organic matter increases the temperature. This is our next thing we're looking at. So what we're looking at, carbon to nitrogen, means that the bacteria are growing actively. If they're growing actively, they have physical metabolic heat, just like you and I. We get warm. Like when we're extra warm, we sweat. And so microorganisms produce heat from their activities, believe it or not. And those heats, that temperature is what heats the composting pile, which is really important. And again, we're going to look at this a little bit later. So here's a list of some typical greens and browns. So greens, vegetable peelings, fruit peelings, grass clippings, an important one, coffee grounds, an important one, green plant cuttings. So this could be weeds you've pulled up from your garden. This could be trim, maybe suckers from your tomatoes, whatever. Then as far as browns go, there's dead brown leaves, there's straw, there's shredded paper. This is a good one. Wood chips. Eggshells is here, and to be honest, eggshells kind of fall into their own category. Plants need and enjoy a certain amount of calcium, and if you go on the internet, you'll see eggshells on both the green and brown side. It doesn't matter. They really take a long time to break down, but they are essential to get the calcium that plants need. Calcium's a tricky thing to get into your soil if you don't have it. Conventional farmers like to use, gypsum or something that is calcium phosphate to boost the calcium in their soil, where if you're growing organically, getting calcium can be challenging. So eggshells is a really good method to do that. So anyways, here's the help to help you distinguish. Green has been recently alive. If that helps you distinguish the two. So again, the carbon-nitrogen ratio, this Goldilocks scenario, if you have too much carbon, things slow down and you don't have enough nitrogen to make proteins. If you have too much nitrogen, you actually get ammonia, which evaporates, and you lose your nitrogen from your soil. You actually lose the nutritional value in your compost. So you may think, well, I'm adding lots of extra vegetable waste. This should be great. Well, no. It's got to be in that 25 to 30 to 1 ratio for you to end up with the right amount of nutrients in the finished product. You overdo this, you make ammonia, which you can smell. It's nitrogen that's evaporating. If you don't believe me, think about Windex. Windex is used to clean windows because it's got lots of ammonia. And when you spray it on the glass, it evaporates, leaving no streaks. So when you have too much nitrogen in your compost, the bacteria produce ammonia, and that nitrogen evaporates to the atmosphere, and you end up with less nutritional value at the end of the day. Not to mention, you have an impact on your pH, which will rise and can cause toxic conditions for some of your beneficial bacteria and fungi. So all around, adding too much of your fresh scraps in the kitchen is not a good thing for your compost. You can use them, but first of all, they should be shredded, and they should be at a 25 to 30 to 1, so lots of carbon and only a little bit of that. This is not shredded. This is rough. There's a lot of organic kitchen waste here, and it's not broken into small parts. So this is going to struggle to break down. It will break down eventually, and you will not necessarily have the best quality compost at the end of the day. So these are some examples, and in your lab, you're going to go through these exercises where there's different ingredients that are proposed, and each ingredient has its own carbon to nitrogen ratio, right? You rarely have something that's only carbon or only nitrogen. They just have varying degrees of both in them. And so in the lab, the exercise is to pick the right ingredients to achieve a 25 to 31 final ratio in your compost. So grass clippings have quite a bit of nitrogen. So nitrogen is always brought down to a number 1, which means carbon relative to nitrogen is fairly low. There's lots of nitrogen and not as much carbon in grass clippings. In leaves, there's more carbon to 1 nitrogen. So they contribute a lot more carbon than they do nitrogen. And vegetable waste is around the same as grass clippings, 15 to 1. But if you remember the last slide looking at particle size, grass clippings are always nice and finely chopped, where your vegetable waste can be big and lumpy and takes longer to break down. But they contribute similar ratios of carbon to nitrogen. And then lastly is sawdust, which is kind of an extreme example of basically almost all carbon and very little nitrogen left. So in the lab, you have different ingredients. You fill out the table and you add up how much each is contributing to the ratio to figure out what the ratio is in your finished product. And if it's too far off, then your composting isn't going to work, and you got to figure out, okay, how do I fix this to bring it to 25 to 30 to 1 ratio, right? So say you added lots of grass clippings and vegetable waste, you may want to say, look, I need to add a lot more leaves. Well, how much? Let's figure it out with the spreadsheet. And then you get the right ratio. Now, I think once you've done enough composting yourself, you have a pretty good idea. But if you're a commercial composting, they take this very seriously, and they actually use these spreadsheets. But it's a useful exercise to go through. So here's a sample of the table that would be in the lab, right? So you've got grass clippings, which are 12 carbon, 1 nitrogen, leaves, which are, say, 50 to 1 in this particular example, sawdust, and vegetable waste, okay? So you can't just add these up down here. You got to look at what percentage, right? So if I have 25% of this in my final and 20% of this and 25% of that and 2% of that and 48% of this, we end up with a ratio of 31 to 1. So you can play around with the percentages of each ingredient, right? Say you wanted to increase the carbon content from 31 to 40 to 1. The easiest would be to adjust this down and your leaves up slightly until you get the 40 to 1 that you're looking for. So this is a percentage, right? These are percentages over here on the left. This is a percent. So 25% is the same as multiplying by 0.25, right? Times your 12. So a quarter of 12 is 3. So that's going to contribute 3 to your final total. And a quarter of 50 is going to be whatever, 11.5 plus 11. I don't know. I'm not doing the math. You can do the math. And then 2% of 400 is, well, 1% would be 4. So 2 is 8. Maybe I'm wrong. Math is not my strength, so you can figure this out. And then 0.48 is roughly half of this, so we're going to say plus 7.5. And then you add that up, and it should come to 31, something like that. So that's how you calculate it, okay? You'll be doing that in your lab exercise. Again, you're not handing it in, but when you get the quiz and your midterm, you need to know roughly how to calculate this. So I mentioned earlier that as composting happens, the temperature in the compost increases. And that was where the critical size of the composter, 3x3x3 and 4x4x4, is to get the right amount of oxygen so the bacteria grow. This graph, what does it show us? At the bottom, it's saying the number of days of decomposition. And if you look here, the 30-to-1 ratio, this is carbon to nitrogen, again, just like what we just talked about. At the correct ratio, we're looking at finishing with a high temperature, and it looks like it's done to a higher degree, right around here, 50-day mark. But the critical thing is the temperature, right? So if you have too high a carbon, it doesn't achieve a high temperature. And a really high carbon, it doesn't get hot much at all. Looks like about 115 degrees Fahrenheit as opposed to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. So having the right ratio means that the right bacteria are growing. And let's take a look at that. So before I get into that, let me summarize your carbon to nitrogen, right? So if we have the correct carbon to nitrogen ratio, we get the right temperatures, we get the right rate of degradation. Some extra notes here would be that if you add compost to your garden that has not finished composting, right? It's still undergoing decomposition. It will actually steal the nitrogen. Remember, let's say we're looking at 30-to-1 as a ratio. Ideal ratio. If you put that in your garden, it's going to look for the nitrogen in your soil, and it's actually going to consume the nitrogen that's in your garden soil and not leave it for your plants. So be aware that you have to have compost finished. Okay, microorganisms use nitrogen in the soil. We talked about that. How do we know if it's finished? Oh, that's an important one. Let's look at this one. Okay, so how do we know if composting is finished? Temperature, which we'll clarify soon. That's coming up after this. I think this slide actually should have been before the last one, but it doesn't matter. So temperature is a big indicator of whether your compost is done. The color and texture, like in my video for visiting Thiessen Farms, you can see what it looks like. It's got a real nice soil-like structure. And the texture, it should be, again, soil-like. And the smell is important. It should have a nice earthy smell. We want that that nice earthy smell. That tells us that the soil's finished and it's got the good fungi in it, specifically actinomycetes. So looking at temperature, this is, you're gonna see a little more of this graph as we go forward, but this is showing the temperature as it changes in compost and the type of bacteria that sort of are part of each stage of compost as it undergoes degradation. So let's take a closer look. Down here around 10 degrees Celsius, we have what are called psychrophiles. And then in the up to about 45 degrees Celsius, we're using mesophile bacteria. And then when you get hotter than that, it's the thermophile bacteria. So there's kind of it's like a passing the baton in the race. The psychrophile bacteria get it started, and then the mesophile bacteria move in, and then eventually the thermophile bacteria are really successful until they run out of nutrients and it starts to cool, and then we go back to the mesophile, and there's a little bit of a blip, and then we finish, and the compost cools as it finishes. So starting with the psychrophile bacteria, these are aerobic bacteria that prefer 12 to 20 degrees Celsius. They produce enough heat to sort of get the compost going. and then the next bacteria start to take over. Now, if you're growing in a 4x4x4 composter, they are always present around the exterior where it's cooler, right? In the center of the compost is where it's hot, on the outside is where it's cooler. So the psychrophile bacteria are always there, and if something goes wrong, they will continue the degradation, but at a much slower rate. So then there's the mesophilic bacteria. They take on the 20 to 40 degrees Celsius range, so the compost starts to really get warm, and they begin to decompose organic matter and produce organic acids and heat. Right? So the temperature starts to go above 38 degrees Celsius, and then we kick into the thermophile bacteria. So the thermophile bacteria thrive from 45 to 70 degrees Celsius. It's pretty hot. At this temperature is where we kill most of the microorganisms, seeds, and spores of pathogens. This is one of the beautiful things about compost, is that it's self-cleaning, right? So the soil becomes so hot that it pasteurizes it and kills off bad bacteria, even kills weed seeds if it's done properly. One thing it doesn't necessarily kill is viruses. So if you pull out virus-infected plants, you should not put them in your compost. They should be bagged and then discarded. Otherwise, you'll risk spreading virus in your plants. So if your tomatoes or peppers had funny streaks last year, I hope you didn't put them on the compost for this year, because you may end up with it again. If the temperatures start to get too hot, you can actually have the bacterial population crash. So in the commercial context, that's when they blow air in to help cool it off. So they're using air not just to provide oxygen, but to also maintain the ideal temperature. So they probably have a temperature probe in there, and the fan kicks on when they, if it overheats. So there it is, passing the baton. So temperature is critical, like I said. The thermophilic stage is where we get that pasteurizing. It kills pathogens, fly larvae, and weed seeds. And we're looking at, it doesn't last that long here, 3 to 5 days. But if you have a little too much carbon, it can stretch out. But otherwise, it happens fairly quickly. If you stop adding food to your compost, it will slow down and move into the finishing stage. So you can kind of confuse your compost if you're kind of adding and not, and starting and stopping it. This is why a lot of times some serious gardeners or even commercial gardeners have usually 3 different composting bins side by side by side. And they get one going, and then they sort of finish and leave it alone so it can mature, and they move on to the next one. And 3 is typically enough to have in complete rotation all the time. So there's always one you can throw stuff on, so you're not wasting any material. So the maturing phase, this is the last stage where it starts to cool off. And this is where the magic happens with the actinomycetes bacteria. These actinomycetes break down cellulose and lignin, and they are what produces that earthy humus smell. So they start to really break down the compost into the kind of nutrients and the structures that soil really likes for holding other nutrients. So it's a really important stage, not to be neglected. So when it's all said and done and your compost is done, this is where sometimes there's a little confusion. Some people make kind of false claims about it. Typically, you're looking at 1 to 2% nitrogen, less than 1% phosphorus, and around 1% potassium, which is very low numbers, right? That would be like going to the store and buying a 2-1-1 fertilizer, right? So they also have very low levels of calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. This is a fact. This is something that a lot of times people, they sort of a convenient thing they want to ignore, right? And this is where, especially commercial organic farmers that are honest and do their best, will acknowledge these challenges and amend their soil if they can. I'll let you in on a little secret on how a lot of organic farmers fix this conundrum, and they use mushroom compost. And that sounds wonderful, right? Well, hey, Derek, that's organic. They fix their calcium magnesium issues by using mushroom compost. Isn't that fine? Well, it is and it isn't. The reality is mushroom compost is made from straw, manure, and the third ingredient is gypsum, which is basically commercial magnesium and calcium sulfate. So it's used in fertilizers, and it's a major ingredient in mushroom compost. So it's a sort of a backhanded way of getting their calcium magnesium. But before we start to say, those cheaters, the reality is it's very, very difficult to get those nutrients sufficiently in your soil through just traditional methods. At least in the context of agriculture, where we're consuming product off the fields and taking it away, right? I mentioned this in one of the other lessons. If we were just growing a garden, right, grew up our plants, and we let them grow and be happy and drop their fruit and die and compost in the same soil, the nutrients are recycled. It's less of an issue. But when you have a garden, right, and you grow your tomatoes and you harvest the tomatoes and you sell them to someone who runs away and eats it at their house somewhere else, and it goes somewhere else, that nutrient is lost. So precious nutrients like calcium, magnesium, and sulfur become limiting in agricultural contexts, where we're taking those nutrients and moving them elsewhere, i.e. selling the produce. So we have to factor in that you cannot grow in straight compost. This is another thing I've mentioned. Compost is an amendment to soil. It is not something you just stick in a pot and grow in. It ends up having too much water holding capacity, and you don't get enough oxygen. 5% oxygen is fine for bacteria. It's not fine for your plants. They end up dying. So typically, compost is used as a soil amendment. Now, again, let's say my example from Thiessen Farms, they're using about 10% of their soil amendment, probably less than that. That means that 10% of these NPK ratios is being added to the soil. Not a lot. So you got to be careful you don't overtax your fields, because you're going to rob all the nutrients and your plants will struggle. So you have to have sort of realistic expectations. These are NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium ratios of some typical manures and whatnot to compare. Poultry manure, which is very high in nitrogen, it's about 4 to 3 to 3 is your top end of the ratios. Feedlot manure, this is for cow manure, 3, 1.5 to 2. Dairy manure, 2, 1.5 to 2. Urban yard waste, 1.5 to 0.5 to 1.5. Crop residue. This is interesting. Crop residue is what we call no-till farming, where the farmers harvest a crop and then they turn it into the field and allow the material to be reused. Like corn stalks and cobs, they get shredded and put back on the field. They have a nutrient ratio of 2.5 to 0.5 to 2. Not bad, really. One of the things we want to keep in mind, though, is that nutrients from compost are in reserve, which means there's organic matter in your compost, which continues to feed and release as microorganisms continue to break it down, which means that they continue to release nitrogen over time. So it's like a slow release. So think of it as like nutrients in waiting. So, they still need to be mineralized by bacteria. That's an important term. And so when you add compost, it's not like they just get one single shot of 1 and 0.5 and 1% fertilizer. There's more that comes out over time. So sometimes people who want to criticize it will say, oh, look, there's so little nutrient content. Well, that's not entirely true, because it's released slowly over time. But there are still some realities that, it's difficult to get a lot of nutrients in very quickly for really pushing crops for higher yields. There's a lot of people working on this stuff, though, to improve that. And maybe in the next few years, we'll learn even more about that. These are just some pictures of typical examples of composting. This is my favorite down here, the fencing, just making boxes, and you've got 1, 2, and 3. This is ideal for your garden to rotate between these. And just like Ted McGraw says in his video, if all you ever do is put leaves and grass clippings in here, you will have the best compost ever, even if you don't turn it. This would be 1 year, 2 year, 3 years every third, once you're at 3 years in, you'll have a constant rotation of a full bin of really good soil coming out. That's if you do nothing, like you don't turn it, you don't aerate it, that kind of thing. Then there's some fancy raised beds things. There's like tumblers. You can try to mix it and aerate it. Overly complex. This is some sort of commercial thing. I don't know. Someone's just drilled a bunch of holes in a garbage bin here. That's maybe a little farmerish. Maybe they took their shotgun and just shot it through. I don't know. Here's the tool I was telling you in the beginning to wait for. This is a fantastic compost turning tool. When you push it into the compost, you'll see these paddles flip up so you can push down into your compost. And then when you pull up, they flip out and they lift and turn the ingredients. So you just stab it into your compost 3 or 4 times, pull it up, and you've mixed your compost. This simple tool you can make on your own. You can buy them online from fancy places that know how to garden. Just the simple act of turning your compost can accelerate the composting process by 4-fold. Pretty quick. You can make compost within a few weeks this way, so it's a useful tool. I'm going to skip this slide. Well, I'll talk about it a little bit. This is modern agriculture's take on using bacteria to break down waste to turn into both nutrients and fuel. You've probably heard of biodigesters. They have these tanks where you put a feedstock in here where they ferment and produce methane gas. The methane gas is collected, right? So the nitrogen is lost. Keep that in mind. But it's lost on purpose because they want to make nitrogen gas or methane, which is then burned to make electricity. And the heat from the burning also is used to heat things like greenhouses or heat barns where animals are. So they're producing electricity and they're producing heat. Biodigesters are pretty cool. They really only make sense if you have a lot of organic waste you need to get rid of. And dairy farms have a lot of organic waste, so they put it in something like this, and they generate their gas to make heat and electricity. Once it's done, the nutrients that are left actually are used as organic fertilizer, and they spread them on their fields. It's not super high in nutrients, but there's definitely something there. So it's a pretty high-tech way for being a very efficient farm, which brings me to my next slide. And this is my all-time favorite farm on planet Earth. I've tried to guess where it is. I'll tell you about it, but just figure out what country this farm is located in, and you'll be surprised. What we have here is a dairy farm, right? So there's all sorts of cows in here, and there's silage in here, which is what they use to feed the cows through the winter. And in the winter, all the surrounding fields are used to grow grain, which then feeds or goes into the silage to feed the animals. The animals produce a huge amount of milk. There's a link on this, by the way. If you click on the picture, it takes you to the website. The dairy farm produces a huge amount of milk, which is then taken away and sold. And the manure is sent to, and you may recognize these domes, to biodigesters. And the biodigesters, let me erase some of these lines. The biodigesters produce electricity to run the entire farm and heat for a greenhouse that produces a huge amount of tomatoes. And then when the biodigesters are done, the slurry goes out and is put on the fields for fertilizer. And rain is collected on the entire greenhouse and put into the tanks, so they don't use surface water. And that water is sterilized and used for watering the tomatoes and watering the cattle. This is almost a fully self-sufficient farm that is producing more electricity than they consume. Their excess electricity goes out into the grid, supplying houses in the surrounding communities. This is a model example of what modern agriculture can do. Now, what country is this in? I think it might surprise some of you. A lot of times we have these ideas that we in the West are, at the top of our game. Well, that's not true at all. I think in many ways we're kind of slipping, but this is in Croatia. This is Croatia, Eastern European country. Sometimes people like to think that Croatia is some sort of backward country. It's not. Hollywood will make you think certain things, but Croatia is taking modern agriculture very seriously, and they want to be self-sufficient and produce as much of their own food as possible for their own security. I think having gone through COVID-19 now, maybe us in North America might think a little more about this in terms of where our food is made and how we get it, so that we can be a little more self-sufficient when times become suddenly tough. Anyways, that's it for composting. I hope you learned something, and I hope you're able to make your way through the lab and the exercises. Please do your best to give them a shot. Send me an email if you're at all lost, and I'll do my best to help you. All right, take care. Bye.